forgive me, I'm supposed to talk in English now, so thank you for the warm applause. She is the world's first professor in user-led research, which is surely a milestone for the service user movement. I'm very proud to introduce her here. Diana Rose is professor in user-led research and co-director of the Service User Research Enterprise, SURE, at the Institute of Psychiatry at the King's College in London. She is a social scientist and has also used mental health services all her adult life. She aims to put the service user's perspective into all aspects of the research process and to encourage others to do likewise. I'm looking at all the researchers now here. Exactly. She argues that if research and its implementation is based on the service user's perspective, then this will add value to conventional research and sometimes challenge it. Thank you very much, Diana Rose.
I've slightly changed my title. I am going to talk about user-led research, and I am going to talk about recovery, but I'm going to be quite critical of the concept of recovery, which probably leaves me out on a limb in relation to this conference. The presentation is quite focused on the kinds of research I do now, but more basic material and how we got to where we are now, I'm going to cover in the workshop if you're interested in that. So here's an overview. I'm going to talk about user-valued outcome measures. I believe that the translators had some problem with the concept of measures. Really, I mean user-valued questionnaires that are used in studies. So I'm going to talk about findings from what we call a nominal group, and then patient-generated, patient-reported outcome measures. I'm then going to move on and do a case study of one person, which is an object lesson in how not to do recovery. I'm going to talk about an argument that we find a lot in Great Britain, that many mental health services make people too dependent and they shouldn't use those services. And I'm going to say that that argument's a bit dangerous in the current context of cuts that we have in health services in the UK, and conclude by saying why I'm not over the moon about the concept of recovery. Here's a little bit about where I work. The Service User Research Enterprise is located at the Institute of Psychiatry, which is at King's College London. The Institute of Psychiatry is the biggest psychiatric research institute in Europe, and it's generally thought to be very conservative. When I went there, I was warned in no uncertain terms. People said things like, you're going into the lion's den, they'll eat you for breakfast and spit you out. But actually, they are quite positive about user-focused research. SURE is meant to be collaborative. We have one conventional researcher as co-director and myself as the other co-director, and most of the team have used mental health services themselves as well as being researchers. But we tend to do the user-led components of very large studies. Right. So I'll begin by describing this nominal group technique for outcome measures, which is written up in a paper by Mike Crawford and a bunch of the rest of us. What a nominal group is, it's a way of trying to get a group of people to reach consensus on something. And what we were interested in was outcome measures that are used in large studies. And we wanted to find out which measures are valued by service users, because the argument was that the measures that are valued by clinicians might not be the same ones as the measures that are valued by service users. So we collected around 20 outcome measures that are commonly used in trials or other forms of research for people with a diagnosis of depression and people with a diagnosis of psychosis. we asked the people with two separate groups, depending on the diagnosis. We asked the people with the diagnosis to rank the measures, which they like the best, down to which they think is the worst. Then we take away their ratings, we calculate the median and the range, we bring back to the group and they discuss the measures amongst themselves, and then they produce a final ranking of which measures they like the best to which measures they like the worst. And the idea is that the discussion brings people closer together, so that's why it's called the consensus technique. So these are the findings for the psychosis group, which we found quite interesting. The measure they thought should always be used in studies of people with psychosis was a neuroleptic side effects measure. Total surprise to the psychiatrists on the team. Social functioning measures were disliked. So measures that ask questions like, do you ever stay in bed for more than a day and not talk to anybody else? People didn't like those kinds of measures because they said, sometimes I stay in bed for a week and that's to protect my mental health. It's not a negative thing, it's not an expression of negative symptoms, it's a positive thing, it's to protect my mental health. So they didn't like social functioning measures because they thought they were normative. And I'm going to say a bit later that this is true of recovery measures as well, some of them anyway. A well-being measure that had some service user input was valued. Are you familiar with the recovery star measure? No. Well, it's supposed to be a measure of recovery, but it did not have high ratings amongst our nominal group. So that was a nominal group technique. Side effects measures were high on the agenda for service users. Social functioning measures and recovery measures were not. So now I'm going to move on and talk about outcome measures in randomized controlled trials. Now, it's argued that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard because they are neutral. That's the argument for the gold standard, that randomized controlled trials are neutral, because no values enter in. There's also the issue of blinding. But values enter into the outcome measures. The outcome measures are things that clinicians and academics think are important to measure. But what clinicians and academics think are important to measure may not be the same things as what service users think is a good outcome for an intervention in a trial, for example. So patient-generated, patient-reported outcome measures, I know that's an awful mouthful. We have a big drive in England at the moment to develop something called PROMs, patient-reported outcome measures. But all it means is that the patient fills in the questionnaire. So we have a model for developing patient-generated, patient-reported outcome measures. So I'll do this very quickly because I know I've probably got too much for the amount of time I've got. So patient-generated, patient-reported outcome measures, PG-PROMs, they're a participatory method for generating outcome measures entirely from the perspective of service users. The participants and the researchers share the experience of the service or treatment being evaluated. It's user-led research because the researchers share the experience with the participants, although it may be embedded in larger studies. As I said, it's participatory research. We attempt to reduce the power relation between the people who are doing the research and the people who are the participants in the research. In user-led research, researchers have the same experiences as the participants. Everybody is mental health service users that are involved in the study, researchers and participants, and that's what makes the research user-led. And that's a new development even within participatory research. I don't think I need this. I'll give you an example from inpatient care, which is one of the most recent PG PROMs that we've done. Inpatient care in Great Britain at the moment, I don't know what it's like in Switzerland, especially in the inner cities, is dire. And it's profoundly disliked. There's anecdotal evidence for that, and evidence in what we call the grey literature. That is, literature hasn't made it into the peer-reviewed journals, as if that was very important. I have experience in patient care, and that's my experience too. We wanted to do something more rigorous, and it was to be the main outcome measure in a randomized controlled trial. The trial is now finished, and it was the main outcome measure. So the study was collaborative, but our part was user-led. So voice, views of inpatient care. We started with focus groups, and the initial participants were people who had been inpatients in the local trust, provider hospital, within the previous 2 years. One focus group is specifically made up of participants who'd been detained, compelled. Although at the end of the day, all the focus groups had people who'd been detained in them. 6 to 8 people in each group. One facilitator with experience of inpatient care, that was me, and the other also a service user. They meet twice so that we make sure that we've accurately captured their views on inpatient care. And it was quite interesting in terms of this study. We had 6 to 8 people in 4 groups, about 48 people, and only one person didn't come back for the second round, which is quite unusual. Normally when psychiatrists do research, half the people don't come back. We did a thematic analysis using some qualitative software after both the first and second wave of focus groups. Drafting a measure, which was done by the researchers, the 2 of us, on the basis of the qualitative analysis. It was mixed methods measure. It had quantitative Likert scale questions and qualitative questions, and the researchers also used their own experience, so it was reflective, as qualitative research always is. Then we took the measure to expert panels. One expert panel was drawn from the focus group members and one was independent. We had one expert panel drawn from the focus group members just to make sure that we had accurately captured the views of the focus groups, and then one independent panel, also having used inpatient services in the previous 2 years, but to take a fresh look at the measure. The expert panels were tasked with amending and refining the measure, and very important, making sure the language and the layout were appropriate. In the nominal group study, some of the measures that we put to the groups were really awful, scrappy bits of paper with small print and really virtually illegible. At this stage of expert panels, there's usually quite a few changes made. And then we do a feasibility study, and that's the final stage of constructing the measure. So 50 people, around 50 people, complete the measure, and we find out which parts are easy to complete and which parts still have glitches, still have problems. So it's an iterative process, so 10 people complete the measure, we take it back, we see what the difficulties are, we amend it, give it to another 10 people, until at the end of the day, we think we've got a measure that makes absolute sense to every service user. And in this feasibility study, the participants were actually hospital patients. I'll come back to that. Then we do psychometrics. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about the kinds of psychometrics that we do. It's mixed methods research. We do the psychometrics because it's appropriate, but we also want to show that user-led research can be rigorous. One mainstream researcher from Italy said to me, well, service users could never do psychometric research because they wouldn't understand factor analysis. So we did some factor analysis just to show her that she was wrong. Just one piece of psychometrics that I think is quite interesting, test-retest reliability. So 50 people complete the measure twice, 1 week interval in between, and that's to find out if it's stable, if they give the same responses the second time. Now, standard textbooks say that subjects in psychometrics have to be what they call cognitively intact. Now, our participants mostly had experience of psychosis. They were in hospital. So in terms of this requirement that they be cognitively intact, they probably weren't. But they were perfectly able to do this, and I think that's because the measure was generated by service users, and actually it had very high test-retest reliability, better than most measures. All right, that's enough about measures. We're now going to change gear, and I'm going to tell you a story of N equals 1. And at the end, I'll tell you what method this is now called. The story is about a woman who was admitted to something that called itself a recovery house. Now, she had experienced hypertension. You know, chlorpromazine, Largactil, Thorazine can make your blood pressure drop. She had experienced hypertension due to taking large doses of chlorpromazine, fell through a glass door and sustained very major facial injuries. Her psychiatrist said she can't be left on her own, she needs nursing. She's taking huge quantities of medication. And she had had a previous admission to an acute ward 3 weeks before. Now, in the course of this admission to the recovery house, one of her regular medication ran out. Actually, it was just 5 milligram tablets of diazepam. It was nothing too strong. The recovery staff said she must visit her GP to get the refill of this medication because that is what she would normally do. The whole thrust of this recovery house was that while you were in the recovery house, you must do things that you would normally do. Now, she said the recovery staff said that she must visit her GP to get the refill of this medication, despite the fact that there was a psychiatrist there on staff who could easily have written the prescription. The recovery house was a long way from where she lived, even though it was in the same catchment area. It's a big catchment area. It's a 20-mile round trip by public transport to get this medication. 10 miles to the GP, go to the chemist to fill it, and 10 miles back. And she had facial injuries, and she was very tearful. The GP was absolutely furious. He said that he could have faxed the prescription to the recovery house, and she is so distraught by all this that she takes taxis because she has enough money to do that, mindful that not everybody could afford to take taxis in that situation and would have to go by tube and bus as well as to the pharmacy. So she got back with her prescription, and the recovery worker came and had a chat with her. She was crying because the task had been very traumatic. The reaction of the recovery worker, however, was very positive. He said, "But you got the medication. You achieved your goal." She didn't say, "It wasn't my goal, it was yours." So what happened? You can't be vulnerable in the recovery house. And I think that's a problem with some of the recovery discourse. You could not be vulnerable in this recovery house. You have to be normal. She left the house, even though she wasn't supposed to. I know this. It was me, the story. So, now I'm going to move. Oh, yes. There now is a name for stories like this in English research, service user-led research. It's called an auto-narrative. You tell the story about yourself, it's an auto-narrative. It's a kosher methodology now. So I'm now going to move from research to rhetoric, although it's not complete rhetoric because I have lots of friends still who don't work, haven't made the move that I and other people have made. They're living in the community and they're living in fear. So there is an argument in the UK that service users should not be dependent on services. Get a life, not a service, is one of the recovery slogans. The argument that's promulgated in the UK that all service users should get a job. The argument that traditional day services promote dependency. And this is not just an argument. Hundreds of them have been closed. Now, I don't know how the recession has hit Switzerland, but it's hit the UK badly. And in the context of savage cuts, which is what we are experiencing, I think this is very dangerous. So I worry that the recovery narrative risks justifying cuts in service provision and also making people feel guilty if they can't measure up. So I have a friend who is distraught and beside herself because she feels she can't work, but that means she's not measuring up to what she's expected to do in terms of the recovery narrative. All right. Now the user movement, from social recovery to personal recovery. Recovery started out with the user movement 30 years ago in Canada, the States, New Zealand, not so much in the UK. It was about peer support, collective support. It was about groups. And my colleague Mike Slade, who is going to follow me and no doubt completely contradict everything I've said in this presentation, because he is a psychologist and he wrote a book called Personal Recovery. That's not how it started. It didn't start as personal recovery. It started as collective recovery. But now I think it's individualized, personalized, normalized, and psychologized. That we have a discourse in the UK which is called neoliberalism, which everybody must make their choices, everybody must pursue their own goals, dog eat dog, and late modernity. It fits with this. Also, I think it's particularly a discourse of the white middle classes, because the population differences in the acute ward I was in before I went to the recovery house were remarkable. In the acute ward, which was a standard acute ward, in a central London catchment area, the people were mostly men, mostly middle class, mostly poor, and very many of them were black. In the recovery house, there was a predominance of young, middle-aged white women. So actually the demographics between the two are different, and I think that actually is quite telling. I'd just like to say a little bit about goals. The recovery discourse says the person must define their own goals. But if you look closely, not just any old goal is permitted. You can't have a goal to get drunk 4 times a week. They have to be goals that fit with mainstream society, which again I think is redolent of neoliberalism and normalization. Now I should qualify this. I was in Oslo a couple of weeks back working with an ACT, assertive community treatment team. And they did say that they practiced harm minimization. So they thought it was better for somebody to drink at home than to drink on the streets and sleep on the streets. But that's not where the recovery discourse is at in England. It's about goals that fit with mainstream society. It's about normalizing people. So, it's my conclusion. You get the message. I'm ambivalent about recovery. Now, I don't object to hope. Who can object to hope? You can't either. I have been there many years ago when a community psychiatric nurse said to me, you should never try to work again because it will bring on a relapse. I know what it's like to be confronted with a discourse of hopelessness, and I don't object to promoting hope amongst people. But I think it has to be tempered with the realization that the world of mental health can be a cruel place. And much of our research in SURE shows that the world, society, can be cruel to people with mental health problems. And my problem with the recovery discourse is that it can turn into neglect, leaving users feeling abandoned. So I think, as with many other fields, a liberating discourse can become a disempowering one. Difference. Our society is intolerant of difference. The recovery response to this seems to be to normalize difference. A different response would be to accept and embrace it. Conclusion. So you shouldn't think, I'm sure you don't by now, you shouldn't think that user-led research is tantamount to recovery research. In fact, most recovery research is done by professionals. In some cases, what we do ensure will be very close to recovery research, but in some cases it will contradict it. In my case, I want to produce knowledge from the perspective of marginalized groups, and this is going to proliferate problems as well as solutions before those problems are solved. Thank you.
May I first thank you very much, really.
Microphone?
Excuse me. Sometimes I will speak English, and sometimes don't be irritated, please. May I please thank you first personally, also it's been excellent and brilliant, because I have the honor of already working 6 years in research and development department here, you know, the nursing research. It's always very interesting. 8 times a year we have meeting, but I say something very honest now. I so far never understood everything, to be honest, you know. What can I say? Research is difficult, isn't it? And there were other subjects which I preferred at school, and I learned so much now. So many things became clear to me. Thank you very much. Most insightful. And it's nun frage ich das Publikum. Questions? Fragen?
Okay. Hello, I speak in English because my German is not so good. Okay, so I would like to ask you, I have 2 questions, in fact, if I may. The first is, how about employment instead of recovery? I let you define what it is. And secondly is, mental health is defined usually as looking for well-being. But is it necessary? For me, it is not, and I know other people where well-being is not necessarily what is the goal at the end.
Okay, I think empowerment and recovery are quite close together. The WHO in Europe talks about empowerment. So I was at a conference in Lille in January, where they had developed some empowerment indicators, and they asked me to give a talk, and I gave a talk about recovery instead of empowerment, because empowerment was last decade in England, and now everybody talks about recovery. But equally, I still think that empowerment is not something that professionals can do to service users. You have to do it for yourself. And I think to do it for yourself, you need to do it collectively. So the same argument applies. I mean, as to mental health meaning well-being, well, it's a new idea, mental health and well-being. At least it is in England. And I think that what I said about difference, tolerating difference, you know, why should people measure up to what the norms of society are? Why can't they just be themselves, and we try and make society more tolerant of people who are different?
Thank you very much. You talked about recovery and how good it is, but also at the same time that there's a great danger of neoliberalism, etc. if it's not handled well, if I understand well. Do you see that mostly for Great Britain, or do you see similar tendencies in other countries too?
I'm not sufficiently familiar with Europe, but I definitely think it's happening in North America. I think this is a bit unfair, but I think there's also a bit of territoriality going on. So the psychologists are claiming recovery for themselves as better than what the psychiatrists are doing, because the psychiatrists are just handing out pills. So there is a bit of professional gatekeeping of the different discourses. And because psychologists are trained to deal with individuals, it's no surprise to me that Mike Slade wrote a book called Personal Recovery. Because that's what psychologists do, they deal with persons. They don't deal with, well, sometimes they do group work, but they don't really deal with the kind of collective discourse that shaped me as a survivor activist in the 1980s. They focus very much on the individual, and actually Mike told me, he won't tell you this, that he Googled all various permutations of recovery in other words, and the only one that wasn't already taken was personal recovery, so he used that as a title for his book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for talking about research and talking about the differences of being sort of a radical person yourself when it comes to critique. As a service user myself, I've always had the same kind of difficulties when people ask me, well, what are your goals? It's like you're supposed to have this idea of where you want to be in 5 years. And my question to you would be, what's your alternative when it comes to the collective aspect? Because that's the brilliance that I've discovered. I've suddenly found out that all of this stuff about you've got to do it on your own and you've got to get there and is there a place I've got to be, and it just puts all this extra stress on me, you know? And I finally said that we're in an interrelational field and we can't do it alone. And it's all about us being together. So the best I could come up with is a sentence when someone asks me, well, where do you want to be? I just finally say, you know, I'm just doing the best I can right now. So I'd like to know your answer to that.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, it's quite interesting that when I got this professorship, which was only on the 4th of March, so it's quite new, I thought, oh my God, my friends in the user movement are going to say you've gone over to the dark side now. But actually, what fellow service users and survivors said was, this is an achievement for the movement as well as a personal achievement. Having always tried to do things collectively, that was the response I got, and that was great as far as I was concerned.
Awesome. Okay, so now we move on to Mike Slade. Please, yes?
Okay, so I thought that because what I said this morning was quite focused on research, that it might be quite a good idea to tell you how we got from the beginning to where we are now. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the history of user involvement in mental health research in the UK and what its roots were and how it developed. So I'll just say a little bit about it, just one slide, and then talk about the history of user-led research in the UK. And then I'll stop and we can discuss that, and then if there's time, I'll go through some of the challenges. Because although you might think it's very well embedded in the UK, plenty of people object and have criticisms of what it is we're doing. I'm very sorry, I have to leave a quarter to one. It's time I thought we were going to stop. So I have what I call a double identity as both an academic and a service user. I've been a service user of mental health services all my adult life. I actually took the final examinations for my first degree in a mental hospital, and my psychiatrist was my invigilator. Between 1972 and 1986, I had an academic career. I was a researcher and a teacher. I hid my mental health problems from my employers as best I could, but in 1986 everything went pear-shaped and I couldn't hide them anymore. So I was medically retired, and for 10 years I lived in the community. I lived on welfare benefits. I went to the day hospital every day. I took far too much medication, and I got really fed up with this life at one point, and in 1996 there was the opportunity to do user-led research, and we'll come to how that became possible in a minute. So in 1996 my two identities came together, both as a service user and as a researcher, and that's my double identity. So this is how services were provided in the UK up until the mid-1980s. This is a place called the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. It's my local asylum, and it was established in 1984. Its name was changed to Friern Hospital, and Friern Hospital was said to have the longest corridors of any institution in Europe. And I showed this slide at a presentation in Paris, and there was a psychiatrist there who had worked in Friern Hospital, and he said the corridors at night were so creepy and frightening that if they were called to a ward at the end of one of the corridors, they went on bicycles with their lights flaring to feel safer. In 1974, I was admitted to Friern Hospital, and I Walk the Line is the title of a Johnny Cash song. I don't know, Johnny Cash is familiar in Switzerland. So this is a Friern Hospital patient in 1984. She's one of the last patients in Friern Hospital before it closed, and I'm not quite sure what's wrong with her, if she's very doped up with medication or if she had dementia. I'm not quite sure. So we move on to a local service user group, and this is very important for mental health research in development in the UK. The local service user group is called Camden Mental Health Consortium, and Camden is a region in central and north London where I lived and still live, and the last residents from Friern Hospital were going to be resettled to the Camden area. So we were one of the first local groups, and one of our tasks was to make sure the resettlement was done well. We did other things as well. We did quite radical things. We held huge meetings about coming off neuroleptic medication, and those were the days when many people had been in Friern Hospital for decades. They'd been taking chlorpromazine for decades. They had tardive dyskinesia. They were in terrible state. So we were quite radical as well. In 1988, we did the first piece of user-led research into acute wards, which I'm going to just explain to you. So this is the history of service user research in the UK, and it goes back a long way. It goes back to 1988. The Camden Mental Health Consortium, together with an NGO called Good Practices in Mental Health, did a project on new inpatient provisions in the District General Hospital. So the acute wards had moved from Friern Hospital to a District General Hospital, and we interviewed people who had experience of both to see what they preferred about the new provisions, and if there were any things that they didn't like. In general, they preferred the new District General Hospital, but they missed the open spaces, and they were bored. In the main hospital, you could go and do things all day. You could work, you could work on the farm, you could work in the kitchen, you could work in the workshops. In the District General Hospital, there wasn't much to do. So that was 1988, first piece of service user-led research. There was also some user-led research going on in Bristol, which is in the west of England. And then 1996 was a key year, nearly 20 years ago now. A key year for reasons that will become clear in the next few slides. So there were 2 user-led projects based in non-governmental organisations. Do you know what a non-governmental? Yeah, okay. So one was called Strategies for Living, and it was at a place called the Mental Health Foundation. And Strategies for Living interviewed people about how they cope with their mental health problems alongside of or instead of statutory mental health services.
So
I don't know if mainstream statutory services provided by the state, the NHS and social care. User-focused, the main person in Strategies for Living was a woman called Alison Faulkner. User-focused monitoring was at the Sainsbury Centre for Mental Health, and it was a model for peer evaluation of local mental health services. So I did this. This is how I got back into work. I trained up local service users in how to produce questionnaires and how to interview their peers and how to help analyse the results. And we made reports and we gave them to the people who had asked for the reports, and hopefully they made changes on the basis of the report, things that people didn't like. The main thing about this is that both Strategies for Living and user-focused monitoring were based in the user movement with strong political roots. So Alison and I were members of the user movement, and we took our research questions from the movement. So in terms of mental health, what happened to the people who had been around in 1996? Well, some of them went freelance. My friend Alison Faulkner still is a freelance researcher, so she does work often for service user groups, doing work with alternative services, evaluating them, still wanting to evaluate user-led services, really to give them credibility if they deserve credibility, so staying much more rooted in the service user movement. There are also single user researchers in university departments, people in university departments that are friendly to service user researchers, but they're by themselves. They're the only ones. And in the early 2000s, 2 groups in universities developed. One was called, it's confusing because they both have SURE in the title. SureSearch was in a city called Birmingham, which is in the west of England, and they do research and training and development. Their head of SureSearch recently retired. I'm not quite sure what's happening with them at the moment. Service User Research Enterprise, I went there in 2001 as project coordinator, and I explained that this morning. But in all cases, freelance researchers, single user researchers in university departments, people in groups. The argument is that service user researchers have insider knowledge. So clinicians know something about treatments and services and conditions. Managers know something about treatments and services and mental health conditions. Service users know something else because they know it from the inside. SURE, as I said this morning, has a collaborative management structure, one conventional university researcher and one user researcher. And SureSearch is much more of a loose federation of people. People don't work for it full time. Very few people work for it full time. Whereas in SURE, people are employed full time to work. So the move into universities meant that we were using much more conventional research methods, so we can adapt. So we did a project, one of our early projects was on consumer perspectives on electroconvulsive therapy. And we found that if the research was done by service users, you got a totally different picture of what having ECT was like than if the research was done by clinical academics. Because an unholy around this piece of research, but it impacted practice because our National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which has guidelines for practice across medicine, said that we had discovered that people were not given enough information about ECT. They did not freely sign the consent form. In particular, they hadn't been given information about possible side effects of memory loss. So all this is now built into the consent form for ECT. So that was an example of service user-led research directly impacting policy. And some psychiatrists were very, very critical of this, although in the end, the Royal College of Psychiatrists set up an accreditation system for ECT. But also in terms of more conventional research, we ended up doing the kinds of things that I described this morning with outcome measures, which is not really the kind of thing that I was doing at the Centre for Mental Health, although we try and generate outcome measures in a totally different way to mainstream researchers. It's not an easy place to be because mainstream research is all around us and there are only 8 or 9 of us. But partly because our main funders require patient and public involvement in research now. Practically the entire Institute of Psychiatry is knocking at my door saying, can you write the PPI section of my application form, please?
What does PPI stand for?
Patient and public involvement. Patient and public involvement. And it's quite telling because you can tell that some people have thought about it really carefully and they really mean it and they just want help in putting it forward in the best possible way. On the other hand, other people just want to tick the box. They know they have to put something, so they just ask me to write it for them. And I said to my head of department, do I have to do this? He said, yes, that's what you're there for. So that, I think, is the end of my history. Yeah. So that's basically where it all came from. It came from the user movement, and many people still identify with that movement. I do identify with that movement, although I can't really do anything practical anymore partly because my wonderful local user group, Camden Mental Health Consortium, has been closed down. But even before it was closed down, there was no way I could get to meetings because it's like a 2-hour journey from my place of work to where the meetings took place. But I keep in touch with the user movement, and I keep in touch with people who are freelance and people who are single researchers in university departments, and yeah. So we can stop there. I've got some more if there's time, but perhaps you'd like to discuss that.
You are a member also of the NS Benefits.
I am. Well, NS is a network of networks.
I am also a member, the support member. It stands for European Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry.
So SURE is a member of NS. I don't think my co-director knows this.
Well, yes, have you got any questions? I have a question. You know, here in Switzerland, user involvement is not yet stipulated by the government. It's not obligatory yet. No? I wonder, like, probably our user movement or consumer movement is too nice, you know, too Swiss. I don't know. But because I'm asked, you know, my question is, well, I'm thinking of the history was, well, you know, was it due to the fact whether Labour was in the government, or how did you come to power, sir? You know?
Well, it's a long story. In terms of what the government wanted, in 1990, local authorities like the council, the city council, it was mandated that they consult with users of social services on their community care plans. And that was the beginning of official backing for users of social care services to get involved. And over the years, successive administrations, Tory or Labour, put more and more emphasis on user involvement. But actually in mental health, people had been organising before 1990. So we had something called the Mental Patients Union in the 1970s, and in the 1980s we had Survivors Speak Out, the United Kingdom Advocacy Network, and these were like very radical groups. It doesn't map easily onto the political colour of the government, because the government under John Major, who succeeded Margaret Thatcher, actually the radical groups were given quite a lot of power. John Major set up a mental health task force, and that task force had a user group, and these were prominent members of the radical user movement. And they drew up a charter of demands, which was things like non-medical crisis houses, help with coming off neuroleptic medication.
If you don't mind, I go back to this document, sorry.
Okay. When the new Labour government came into power in 1997, I hate to say this, but it was almost a backlash. The mental health task force was abolished, and with it the user group, and although the Tory government had supported community care, the first Minister of Health under the Labour government said community care has failed. It's leaving people vulnerable and violent. So they published this document in 1999 called Mental Health Care Safe, Sound and Supported, which really painted a picture of people who use mental health services as a nuisance and potentially dangerous. So it wasn't the case that when we got a Labour government in 1997, suddenly more power was handed over to service users. Actually, it was the opposite. And I think what happened throughout, for a long time there was no national mental health group, user group. And the Department of Health under Tony Blair didn't single out mental health as a specific speciality, but they did have a very consumerist notion of the NHS. So they published in 2000 a health bill in which it was announced the customer is king. And it wasn't until very recently, just before they lost power, that they published a document on mental health. And somebody asked me this morning about well-being. And there's kind of a myth that mental health policy should be about the well-being of the entire population, so that people with severe mental health problems, for want of a better term, are sort of buried in a concern that everybody should take responsibility for their own health, which I think is quite close to a recovery discourse myself. And that, I mean, that hasn't changed with the new Conservative government. They're very consumer oriented, and they now have brought in the possibility of private providers. That people can choose to go to the private sector. This must happen in Switzerland. It never happened in England before. Everybody went NHS unless they were super rich. And I think the last government document that came out about 2 years ago from the Tory government was called No Health Without Mental Health. And really it's about mental health services should have the same importance as physical health services. So it's a medical model again. And it does talk about stigma, which is music to the ears of my head of department, because he was doing a lot of work on stigma. That there shouldn't be, there's a scandalous statistic in the UK, which is that people with severe mental health problems die 20 years, on average 20 years earlier than the rest of the population. And some of that is due to something that we call diagnostic overshadowing, which is that people will come to the doctor with a physical health problem, but because they have a mental illness diagnosis, it will be put down to the mental illness diagnosis and not treated. And so they get sick, and mortality and morbidity goes up. So I don't, in answer to your question about the colour, the political colour of the government, in my view, the pinnacle of national service user involvement in the UK actually wasn't under Labour, it was under the John Major government.
Yes, thank you very much for answering.
We do now have a national organisation called the National Survivors and User Network, who are not radical at all.
Oh, okay, that's it's
Well,
yeah, because I really wonder, is it like Mad Pride, for example?
Well, we have my pride.
Yeah, you see that, I'm just saying, what it is for Switzerland, it's demonstrations a bit like gay pride in Zurich. Wie heißt das? Wie Techno?
Street parade.
Street parade.
No, it's more gay pride.
Yes. What I'm trying to say is a lot of fun on the streets, and at the same time, sort of claiming, saying we want equal rights, and we haven't got that here. You know what I mean? That's yeah.
We had a tragedy in our Mad Pride actually, because the leading light in England's Mad Pride actually took his own life.
Who's that?
Pete Shaughnessy.
Sorry?
Pete Shaughnessy, it's an Irish name. And after that, the fire kind of went out. But it survived again. And it's true that the National Service User Survivor and User Network do publicise Mad Pride events. And they have, I don't know what you call them, they have what we call gigs.
Yeah,
Events, dances,
yeah,
music.
We understand that. I hope you understand how it's. All the
mean,
rock and roll comes from, like, what can I say? Love, like the Beatles and everything comes from England, so we know what gigs are here too. Yes. Sorry.
even a psychiatrist that I work quite closely with, when he was made a professor, he made his inaugural lecture was entitled "Madness, Drugs and Rock and Roll."
Was Mad Pride connected with also physically handicapped people?
It's a very good question. There are people in the user movement, to the extent that it still exists in the UK, who think that we should adapt the social model of disability mental health problems for psychosocial disabilities. So the social model of disability is that the impairment doesn't really matter. It's society's reaction to the impairment that causes the disability. And people like Peter Beresford,
Yes.
Peter Beresford argue that we should have the same model for people with psychosocial disabilities, that the impairment isn't really important. What really matters is society's attitudes, exclusions, hostility, violence towards people designated man that creates that disability in the first place. If you try and that is kind of a model that's adopted by the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Do you have that ratified in Switzerland?
Finally?
Finally we did, yes.
It was a bit of a shame, not a shame, how can I say it? Sometimes Switzerland is slow on the uptake, but we do in the end conform, you know.
But I have a colleague who's a psychiatrist who's very interested in this stuff. And he thinks that having a mental health act is discrimination. But he's not against coercion. He just thinks that we should have a single act covering everybody.
It's health, isn't it? Somatic health
And then it should, the key criterion for intervening against a person's wishes should be lack of capacity.
not don't choose oneself or don't choose two others. Like,
Lack
but that's not the case, isn't it?
Well, it is in Scotland. Well, Scotland doesn't have one act for everybody, but the key criterion for coercive treatment in mental health in Scotland is lack of capacity. And it took years for our new mental health legislation to get passed, because, and this is all under Labour, in 1997, almost immediately the government was elected, they set up a commission to look into reform of the Mental Health Act. And it was chaired by a professor of law called Ginevra Richardson, who works at King's College. And that's what they recommended, that the Mental Health Act criterion for coercive treatment should be lack of capacity. And the government threw it back. And it took 7 years to get through Parliament. And in the end, what they did was amend the 1983 Act, but they brought in community treatment orders. Do you have those?
Can you explain a bit what it is?
Is if a person is in hospital and the professionals think that it might be possible for them to live in the community but under restriction, so they have to take their medication, they have to live in certain places, they have to attend certain places during the day. That's called a community treatment order.
What would you say? Have you got that? Ambulant device? Yes, we have.
You have it. So this was brought in 2007, and
Before it didn't exist. Before 2007,
it wasn't allowed.
it was allowed.
How sorry. What was the situation like then before? When you say it was
You could only have coercive treatment if you were in a hospital.
you mean coercive treatment outside? So this is considered coercive treatment if somebody has to fulfill certain not regulations. You know what I mean? Somebody has to, like, you could say he does, in the extreme, be wearing something, isn't it? Do you know what I mean?
They do that in forensic in psychiatry. Not yet. Not yet.
Because it's viewed as sort of coercion, not in inpatient surrounding, but in the community. Do you understand?
So mostly people are having medications by injection.
So
So they're not they're not relied on to take their tablets. They have to come to the clinic every 2 weeks and have them, and it's the same here.
Yes.
Yes, yes. But you know, can I just say, that's most interesting to me. I hear that for the first time because this is that. What's the word? Injections.
Yeah, decorated.
Dental injections are considered as a coercive measure. You know, because how can I say? For me, coercive measures are. It's a bit like the Middle Ages. We have restraint. You know what I mean? Restraint or. Well, in different countries there are different techniques. I always thought of sort of mechanical restraint. I was not aware that. Yeah,
But we don't have mechanical restraint in England, but we do have chemical restraint. We can pin you down and inject you with a drug that will make you sleep for 24 hours.
Yes, the same thing. Yeah.
But it's not allowed to mechanically.
No, we can't have mechanical.
What you have, however, in England is what is it called? You know, sort of calming somebody.
Yes, with the injection.
No, but I'm sorry. I read a lot about this. How can you say? Physical restraint, no? Not in the sense of using bandages, but I was in Nottingham and they told us also physical restraint. Not everybody is trained. Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah.
I thought that must be
But
the solution.
at least normally in my experience, if they physically restrain you, they then inject you.
Yeah.
In Switzerland, you can force someone to develop injection? No. Yes, of course.
Not if someone is not get an injection because it's decorated.
Of course, but for somebody, excuse me, but my mother, listen to this, excuse me, if
But
it's okay.
then she was hospitalized.
But no, just gentle. My mother was not well, and my father said, sorry, I'm losing the plot here, and I was the one who, it wasn't forced. You know, I'm trying to say, the question is what is forced, but I said, listen, we are all suffering, and it's better for you now. Do you know? Sorry, this is a bit personal.
That's
but
a social pressure.
That's social, okay,
but if you put it out,
Legally.
only
Legally.
legally it's not allowed.
And
But you have the social pressure that everybody tells you it's good for you, please do it, because then you can get out of the hospital. And I think with this you have also a lot of education.
But it is like this story, but they can force you to go back to hospital
Yes.
if you don't take on your own medication.
That's
It's
the
not allowed in acute situations, even not if you're in hospital. They can only give you like an injection for 3 days. But I mean, it's like forcing. For me, it's the same. I mean, if the alternative is if you go back to you have to be again an inpatient. That I mean, it's forcing it only on a juridical or it's yes, it's a theoretical difference for me. It's not.
shall we say gentle pressure more than a gentle nudge?
But you're right. If you're on a community treatment order and you refuse your deco, then you're back in the hospital.
Yes. But 20 years ago it was allowed to put decorative injection against it. So I know the other side. So now you have the social pressure, or I don't know, everything.
Extortion?
No.
Blackmailing?
Blackmailing. So it's like blackmailing. If you don't take the medication, then you have to do this. But in earlier time, they don't even have to blackmail you, they only can do it. So I think it's a little bit better now, but it changed. Yeah, but it's something.
I have a completely different question. That's a completely different direction. Because in your speech before, you made some critique about this personal recovery term and what I really could understand. But where I didn't really get the point is what kind of alternatives are to this term of personal recovery, and we also talked about like defining goals and what kind of goals would be okay to my English is very bad, but you understand?
Your English isn't bad.
I have difficulties too.
I mean, I'm not saying it's all wrong. I just think the emphasis is wrong. So, to me, the kinds of goals I want to pursue are goals that I can pursue collectively. And they would be things like civil rights and anti-stigma, and something that makes the lot of everybody better. Not to be working with a psychologist on my own individual goals. It's just meaningless to me.
But if I have people on my board and I talk with them about their goals, they don't want to talk about these big things. I'm not sure if they are like two different, the kind of goals.
But isn't it, if somebody asks me what goal you have, no special goal. Nobody has, or not all the time I have a special goal. My day-to-day is dinner, something like this. It's very, I think sometimes I'm a non-health nurse, and now I'm the head of the research group, and I worked over 12 years here in this unit. And I think sometimes we expect too much of not only of mental education, also of people in need of help from professionals. Because we ask them questions we don't ask ourselves. And
I agree with you, because I think, just thinking, the first time I was admitted to the alternative to the bin, the alternative to the asylum in the new District General Hospital, I mean, it was very nice. It was a new building, the staff were great. But every morning they'd come up and they'd say, well, what are your goals for today? And I'm like, what? I don't know. What are yours?
And seriously, they asked you that question. That was,
And you were supposed to say things like, I'm going to read the newspaper, and I'm going to go to such and such a group, but also I take your point very strongly. I mean, I have a very close friend who, her path in life is, although we started off with similar issues, her path in life has been very different from mine. She doesn't work. She has serious issues. She has serious problems. Spends a lot of time on her own. So we'll arrange to meet at the last minute. She'll say she needs to be on her own. She can't meet. And she is exasperated by this whole emphasis on recovery, because it makes her feel guilty. She's not living up to the expectations that this whole recovery discourse has. And that one time I saw her, and also it's all bound up in England. I don't know what your welfare benefit system is like, but at the moment, the Department of Work and Pensions, who administer welfare benefits, are trying to get everybody off welfare benefits and into work. And she said to me, if they make me look for a job, I am going to kill myself. And I believed her. I'm sure she would. In no way could she work. I mean, she's not in a place where she could take on a job, however.
Would it be better to talk about like needs? What are your needs? Did you say?
But she just wants to be left alone.
Because I'm a nurse as well, because I people. I think a lot of people, they are just used to, they are kind of resignated, and they are not, sometimes I think they have to verbalize things, maybe, yes, that could be possible for me, and they are, quite passive position, I think, and sometimes like saying goals or needs can also make some ideas what are my interests, what trends to help people getting active or passionate. Because they are in, like in a psychiatric system and they have to be very passive inside of this system.
I mean, I'm not in favour of passivity, but my friend isn't passive. Basically what she spends her time doing is surfing the net and sending links out to her friends with things that she thinks will interest them.
But then she's happy.
She's happy,
Yes, but then
that.
but that's a different situation.
Yeah, but nobody's paid. It's not a job. And she's being pressured to get a job.
That's bad, but I mean, if people are not satisfied with their life,
Yeah, absolutely.
then you have to give them some ideas or to help them to find new things to do. And then I think yes, why not talking about goals or needs?
I mean, if people are not satisfied with their lives and they think this approach might help them, that's an active choice by them to pursue that approach. But if the approach is forced on them, then forced. You are going to define goals today, and you are going to, you know. But I think that sometimes recovery is what professionals do to service users, and that is no different from what's been happening for decades. I suppose that if people find the approach helpful, I'm all for it. But if they don't find it helpful, then they should be left to do whatever it is they do find helpful.
You have not asked the question yet, no?
I have one. To this point, Mike Slade, I think he said that some results of research have shown that when people are treated in a conventional way or in the frame of recovery, there was no difference. And to me it seemed like an attack, because I think recovery, also with the criticism you give, might still be better than what is the conventional. And I wonder what is your opinion, or if it's because of this criticism that you say that in fact there is no difference. What is your opinion?
Well, I would like, you know, there's two things. One is his intervention. What did he think a recovery focused service was? And what was implemented in that study? Because it was a big study. I mean, he was given a lot of money to do this work. So was the intervention actually empowering and recovery focused? But the other thing is, how did he measure it? Because he didn't tell us that. You know, what measures of recovery did he use? Because maybe the measures of recovery were not, like I was saying this morning, maybe there weren't things that mattered to the people who've been through the program. Maybe he should have been measuring something else that would have picked up any differences. Or maybe it just was that this recovery orientation isn't that different anyway from how services have proceeded for a long time. So I mean, he hadn't written it up yet. He hadn't. It's not published yet.
I have a question. As you said this morning, that the personal recovery model can be instrumentalized by the normalization and neoliberalism discourse. Do you think the recovery movement should be more political, on one hand, and on the other, institutions or organizations who adopt the recovery model, should they be more sensitive to what that can lead if the patient don't recover in terms of guilt, for example, that they are more aware who leads the discourse?
I mean, I think it's very difficult. It's not that I'm ignorant of the position of mental health, but it's very difficult for them to be political in the context in which they find themselves. But there are national treaties, there are recommendations, there are guidelines. Even our nice guidelines can be quite radical, and that would facilitate more of an empowering way of working. So I think it is possible, and that they should do that. And my own experience is, my recent experience is that is very mixed. So I actually had an admission to my local acute unit in October for 3 weeks. And the process of getting me there was wonderful. We did it through a crisis team. The crisis team psychiatrist drove me to my house, packed my bag, took me to the unit. New building, 100 beds, single rooms, ensuite bathroom, everything looked hunky-dory until it came down to the staff. The staff were rubbish. The staff would do things like, you approach a member of staff with a question or a query or because you were in distress, take out their mobile phone and start playing patients on their mobile phone, refuse to meet your eyes, make medication mistakes. Okay, for me, I know what medication I'm supposed to take, but the psychiatrist might have changed somebody's medication and they wouldn't have known. And then when I was due to be discharged, I was confronted with this care plan. Everybody in hospital and the community is supposed to have a care plan. I said, this is a plan we've been following for you as you've been here. One-to-one meetings with a nurse every shift, occupational therapy every day. It was a total fantasy. I never had a single one-to-one meeting with a nurse. And if that's the practice, then I do think that they need to pull their socks off and be human, never mind be empowering for the people who are using their services. I understand that they're very pressured, they're short-staffed, and there are only 2 full-time staff on per shift. They have lots of agency and bank workers, people who are brought in don't know the patients, don't know the wards, but it was rubbish. It was really, really rubbish. And if that's normal, then, something needs to change. So I forgot the second part of your question about...
if the institutions or organizations should be more sensitive if they adopt the recovery model.
Yeah. To people who can't measure up. Yes, I think they should. I also think there's a little bit of hypocrisy, because I was at a day centre, and I just went there to meet somebody, and they were talking about being peer support workers. And I was talking to this woman, and she said she was going to be a peer support worker. This woman was scrambled. She was so distressed and all over the place. And she was going the next day to be a peer support worker. And I thought, this is hypocritical. She can't help anybody. She needs help herself. You can't just pick anybody off the street and say they're going to be a peer support worker. They need training.
She did not training.
Training. She was not in the right place to do this. What she needed was help. Not to be put in the position of being a support worker for somebody else who was equally distressed.
As a researcher, I have the question how to involve users. I know technically how to involve, but in the SIS system, we try to do it, but we have so few users that they are stressed because they have not enough trained people. And so the few we have, they have so many opportunities. I personally think it needs more time to have more people, and that I like to have an experienced person in my team who, if I have a place of position open, then she or he is coming in completely normal, like another worker, like another researcher. Because otherwise I have this special extra for a person, and I think normalization is the normal thing. So perhaps I'm wrong. And if I use this model, so the person has to come in right now, I have to wait 10 years, so this I don't like. So how I can find someone and how I can include someone in my team as a normal researcher with experience.
Okay, so we did some research looking at service user groups and how they got involved and how they shaped services and made an impact on service delivery and how they interacted with managers. It was a 2-year project in 3 locations. Did other things as well. And the first part of what you said, I completely agree with you. I don't know what it's like in Switzerland, but at the moment in England, there are so many changes to our health and social care services. The number of places where you can get involved has mushroomed. And nobody knows where to put their energies. Because you certainly you can't go everywhere. People don't have the resources. And I don't think people who want service user involvement realise the toll it can take on people's energies to do all this work. And mostly they're doing it voluntarily. Maybe they've got a job, maybe they've got family commitments. So yes, there's an issue about all the different places where you can intervene and how you choose where to do that. But the second part of what you said, it was interesting because one of the groups that we followed did not behave itself. So when they were having negotiations with managers, they would be very emotional, very lively, very angry, and they would tell stories, which the managers said were anecdote. What the managers wanted were complaints forms and evaluation sheets, not stories about what it was like to be a service user. Now this group, in the course of our work, which lasted a year, closed down because they couldn't behave as institutional rules and norms expected them to behave. They didn't want to. They wanted to be a campaigning group. 20 years ago, they had been a very successful group, and they couldn't change with the times. So 20 years ago, they had managed to create women-only wards in a local hospital. Great victory. But some of the groups that were more successful kind of trod a fine line because they did speak out from the position of experience, and it was the case that the managers and professionals liked that because they felt it gave them an insight into what it felt like to be a mental health service user, experience treatments, experience services. This was an experience that the managers and professionals didn't have themselves. But they didn't want them to be too angry or too emotional, because if that happened, they think, getting ill again. So I think, I don't think in my life I'm not normal all the time. And my institution puts up with it. So I think it's too much to ask. If you want somebody who really does have the experience of using services and of having experienced distress, they can't be normal like somebody who doesn't have that experience, because that would be to deny a very important part of their life in order that they could be normal.
Well, the regular stuff isn't always normal.
Research are normal. No, it's not to behave normal or to be normal, it's only to come into the group not in a special special position way because, you know, this because I'm a user, I get now this position.
That's a very good question. I'm thinking, can I say something? Because, you see, I don't mean to brag, I say this for the camera, no, but when I was employed first 6 years ago, I think my boss said, try to find out in Switzerland if something like that has been done before, in the sense that an institution creates a job, it was 15% for qualification. You understand that? Probably I was the first in Switzerland to be employed as it said on the sheet, it said on the job task description sheet, betroffene Vertreterin, so that would be representative of people with their own experience on patients, and / translator, which was why I said I've told you this already. But what I'm trying to say is, really, I'm sure I was employed. Do you understand? Because I have lived experience.
So was I.
Yeah. And I have another question, but you would like to finish your question first.
No, can I say something?
Yes,
you can change it around. So I also have other job opinions on, and I look for someone with special knowledge of qualitative research or something. Then I also put in this person because of this special knowledge. So if I try it around and say, I need a user because of this special knowledge, a researcher and an experienced person. So papers completely normal because if you look for a job, they put you because of a special knowledge. So that's the same.
In my research team, all the job descriptions specify experience of using a class.
I see that's definitely. Can I just say?
No, I would like to say something because I'm working with Andrea. I'm like normal staff nurse, and when she first came to us, she had a special position, and there was, I think you felt that as well.
Yes, very much.
Andrea with her story and with experience, but then after some time, that didn't matter anymore. Yes, it really got normal, but if you enter like a conventional group, or then I think you have to live with that first you have this special position, and you cannot accept that at the beginning it's like normal, or it's like a conventional researcher starts. It's different, and yes. That's my
yes. I would just like to say, I'm not sure if you're looking for something in the German-speaking world. Is it okay? I mentioned Ute Kremer. There will be, at the moment in London, is now a lady from Germany is training to be.
She's doing a master's.
She's doing a master's with Diana, and she's called Ute Kremer. So
there's also a lady in Berlin.
There's
a lady in Berlin as well who. Worked for sure.
Jasna Russo?
Jasna Russo?
Jasna Russo.
A year and a half.
So there are people like that.
That's what I mean by people, single people in university. So they exist in Europe as well.
I think this is for me how you can reflect on that, both sides. The conventional team can reflect on this question, and you yourself, can you reflect on your new position and what it leads to. Yeah? And if both sides are open for dialogue and for their own feelings and fears, then it can be a good process, I think. So beyond the working tasks, that you can look on your own professional identity, the different identities, and if you talk about that, that's what you want.
I think it is. I think what you said earlier about organisations can be very resistant, so they can resist champions as well as resisting new people coming in. So organisational, the weight of bureaucracy can be quite difficult to share.
We have Dr.
So I just thought this, I'm really impressed in this outcome. Could you explain something more about the recommending some schemes?
Well, I described one this morning. So somebody asked a question about qualitative research this morning. So the beginnings of the development of an outcome measure is all qualitative research. It's all focus groups and expert panels. It's people discussing. It's qualitative analysis. The special thing is that the researchers are also people who've experienced the treatment or service that's going to be assessed. So all of that is qualitative research. Small numbers, which mainstream researchers don't like, because they think that randomized controlled trials with 1,000 people in them are the best way to do it, to produce evidence. But then we do these psychometric testing, which I think it's important to do it, because you have to show that by developing measures in this way, which is totally novel, you've got something that is just as good as other measures when it comes to their stability, their reliability, their construct, their validity, all those kinds of things. And ours do. But I think we have developed, the first one was on continuity of care, and it took 5 years to get that published. So it's been a long struggle. In the research world, publications count.
Publish or perish.
Publish or perish.
I picked up something in Liverpool University. One semester only, sorry.
No, so we have, it took 5 years to get that measure published, but I think we now have 4 published, different things. CBT for psychosis, the voice, the inpatient one, and
The inpatient?
the one I described this morning. We're doing one on CBT for trauma therapy for people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia who experience trauma. So we're doing a lot, and we're doing them all using the same model of qualitative research followed by quantitative research.
Can I answer the question?
This lady here.
Yeah, if I remember the feminist movement and feminist research and how much research was produced, say, from the 70s onwards, and it was published, but it was not received.
That is a very good point, because I think you asked what is my goal? my goal is not to be happy. My goal is to be the first of many professors of user-led research in mental health. So the feminist movement did just what we've been doing in research, and they succeeded. They got the departments, they got the professorships in the 1970s. They wrote lots of research articles. And they've succeeded. They started from the argument that women have been excluded from science and should be included, and now they are. So I think there's the same argument. Mad people are excluded from science. So my goal is that there should be many more.
Yes, I agree, but it's not the end, because what made me mad is that all these fantastic results of research were there, were published, were around, but it was not received by the mainstream, and then it is like ineffective.
Oh, well, that's true. I agree. It wasn't received.
You're
I remember
question of
discovery which I did not.
question how what good is it for making brilliant work but it's a bit a shame that not more people read these type of papers.
Yeah, like the third speaker this morning, he also says so much is published, for instance, that,
Without consequences.
yeah, and it has no consequences. And I think the feminists, they did one step more, and I didn't follow it closely, but they call it mainstreaming, that is special efforts to get the results into the conventional science building, which was not open for these men. And I ask you if you are also experienced with this kind of work.
It's very complicated because if you're going to succeed in the academic world, you have to mainstream. I mean, you have to publish in the mainstream journals. I mean, I guess my strategy is to publish in the mainstream journals and then to publish in all sorts of little radical journals around the edges. So as to kind of be mainstream, but also kick up a fuss at the same time. Also, kick up a fuss.
That's the scientific way. We now have nursing research. There are so many very good publications from nurses, but nobody's using it. Nursing stays the same over decades till something changed, and society asks why nurses have to do research and so on. So I think that are in many fields, if you ask other researchers, it's the same.
Yes.
That's also a game, I suppose.